On one level today, I'll be telling a story about my grandmother and about my roots. I recently heard a wonderful metaphor that comes from Mahatma Gandhi, the metaphor of the cut flower, describing people who are separated from their roots. Those who immerse themselves deeply in peace and social justice activities, Gandhi says, or immerse themselves in any activity, we could say, without maintaining connectedness with the faith and spirituality that prompted the action, these people are like cut flowers. They have an impact on the world because they're still beautiful, and their striking appearance and aroma are needed to change hearts and spirits. This is still a quote. But because they are cut off, severed from their roots, severed from their roots, they also are doomed to wither. We need ongoing nourishment in Christian faith, I believe, from the roots and the vine, not just from the current flower, if we want to sustain growth. I am the vine, you are just the branches. So for the next 25 minutes, I hope it's that short, I'm simply going to tell the story of my grandmother's life, not because I want to lift her up as a special saint, but simply because I found that she was an example of Mennonite spirituality, and I needed to talk to her before she died. I'm just going to show pictures of her and tell her life story and ask some questions about that life. What formed her? How do we become like Christ? What shapes us now? And how was her formation different from the way the people born today in 2008 will be formed or shaped? And be thinking about how you have been shaped in your life. There's much interest in spirituality today. There's a huge longing and thirst for God, bursting out of our American focus on efficiency and owning more things and rushing around doing everything at once. And I became enthralled with the question, what is Mennonite spirituality? So on another level, this isn't just about my grandmother and my roots. It's about the wider question of whether there is such a thing as Mennonite spirituality. Is there something we as Mennonites can contribute to the growing study and practice of spirituality that is important? This is me with my grandmother in 1954. Her name was Susan Alderfer Ruth. She was born in 1909 and she died in 2005. In those years, in this area just north of Philadelphia, she lived a life that's representative of a certain kind of spirituality. 20th century American Mennonite with Swiss-German roots in Franconia Conference. A particular spirituality that began dying in the 1950s and is now actually an endangered species, much more so than we realize, except among conservative Mennonites who maintain this spirituality. It's a spirituality that formed some of us here today, though to many it will be like entering a foreign country. It will be unfamiliar and new, and that's also important to remember. So as Jim Lapp mentioned, in 2001 I started writing a thesis on Mennonite spirituality, and I decided to do it by talking to my grandmother before she died. And this is partly about being superwoman, or trying to be, which a lot of women do nowadays, and trying to kill two birds with one stone and relate to your grandmother and write a thesis at the same time. But I wanted to talk to her too because her farm is what gave me a sense of being rooted spiritually and emotionally, even though I grew up all over the map, in places that were more urban and suburban, in many ways in a more typical American migratory style. So this is where she lived. It's a picture from 1915, when she would have been 16 years old. This was the house where Susan's parents, I'll call her Susan instead of my grandmother, raised her and 4 older sons beside the Branch Creek and by a large meadow that was always full of cow manure, as I recall, and also buttercups. Susan was born into a community that was very homogeneous, mostly Swiss or German Mennonite, along with a few other Protestant groups, including Dunkers and Schwenkfelders. The community was quite a stable one, and the farm where she was born had belonged to her family for 5 generations. Susan lived in this house from the time she was born till after she was married, when she moved just to the other end of the lane, out toward the road. As a child, she describes being teased and being lonely because she had no sisters, and her next oldest brother was 8 years older. Her happy memories were of playing with her cousin Arthur, who lived in the other half of her house. Here's Arthur and Susan with a dog named Grummel. I think that's Grummel. And they only spoke Pennsylvania Dutch, so the dog had a Dutch name, and I don't know what Grummel means. Grumble. Another early memory, so the dog was named Grummel. Another early memory she shared with me was about music. She played organ and piano most of her life. She said Arthur's father, Uncle Elmer, had, in the living room there, a little organ, and he would play songs, and I would sing. I think I remember that. I guess that sounded something, me singing, that little Dutch girl, you know. Susan grew up speaking Dutch, only German in her family. She didn't learn English until she went to school. I don't know how I made out in school the first year, she told me. School was in English. The teacher certainly was English, and we were little Dutch children. The use of a different language distinguished her from her neighbors in the early part of the 20th century. This sense of being different from her neighbors shaped her. There was even a sense of shame in it. And she used to say when I would play back her voice on the tape recorder, "Oh, I hear my Dutch so." Many times in our conversation, I heard about how she loved books as a child, and she loved books all her life. She mentioned someone buying her a 10-cent paperback book when she was a girl that was read over and over again. Books were not plentiful at all, she told me, and to think I wasn't allowed to go to high school. And look at my granddaughter, that's me, I went to school a lot. She would say, "See, I used to read. She also did some writing. This is her much later, but it's the only picture I could find of her father. Her father is on the bottom left, and this would have been her parents' anniversary. But she wrote her own memories of her father in this following piece. My father was a tall, rather heavy-set man with gray hair ever since I was around. For many years, when I would think of God, I would see him as looking like my father, or even as the patriarch Abraham, that being my father's name also. Could it have been that he was a lot like God in my estimation? One of the first things that comes to my mind when I think of my father is his generosity. If someone needed a loan, they would come to him. I don't recall anyone ever being refused. It probably never all came back. In fact, I know that in a certain case, thousands of dollars did not come back. On 2 occasions when farmers' barns burned down after being struck by lightning, he gave them each a horse. When someone needed a job, it seemed he always gave them work. Day laborers, they called them then. How well I remember the long table in the dining room with me sitting next to my father at one end of the table. And it was lined on all sides with possibly 4 brothers, an uncle, my grandmother Alderfer, a peddler, Abe Levinson, and the day laborers. They enjoyed my mother's good cooking. We would say grace before and after each meal, and I learned later it was always silent grace before and after each meal. Someone borrowed my father's corn planter one time. He didn't return it, so my father bought another one. Those are her memories that she wrote. In these memories, we can see her soul taking shape. God was like her father. Biblical images like Abraham pervaded her mind. Themes like hospitality were central to the extended family, but also to the tramps and local peddler who joined them at their own table. Self-sacrifice was a theme. Another word is yieldedness. That means the same thing. Gelassenheit is the German word. This was embodied in her father's loaning farm equipment, sometimes never returned. Generosity was also in her father's loaning money and never refusing anyone. She continues with these memories. And now we move on to the value of work, another important theme. My father liked to work. He would get up early in the morning and help to milk the cows. He had strong hands, and my husband, who was the farmer at this later date, used to say he could always tell when my father milked the cows the night before. Because of the strength in his hands, it opened the canal where the milk comes out. Tuesday was the day to get things ready for market. They would cut up the pork and get it ready to make sausage, scrapple, roasts to sell in Philadelphia Market at 18th and Ridge Avenue. But once a year on a Tuesday morning in early May, we had a conference-wide mission meeting. That was a special day not to be missed. The work could wait till after supper. One Mother's Day, I bought a Bible as a gift to my mother and decided to buy one for my father also. I can still see that open Bible lying on the dining room table, well worn in the book of Psalms, where I often saw him reading, especially in his later years. As I remember, he used a reading glass at the end. I never heard him pray audibly, but I can still picture him kneeling at his bedside morning and evening. He could not keep a tune, but I remember 2 songs which were his favorites. One was, "I am looking for a city built of God, where the many mansions be." And the other was, "I owe the Lord a morning song of gratitude and praise." Those were her words. And it's very dense, and we could talk about this. There's such a lot there. I noticed that church came before work sometimes. I noticed the Bible was formative, especially the Psalms in one's later years. I noticed daily morning prayer daily prayer in the morning and evening on your knees. And daily life was immersed in nature, too. It was so much taken for granted that I had to ask her about it, remember details of it, because I feel it was very formative, and she just didn't, it was more formative than she even could verbalize. Life was lived by the rhythms of nature, by nature's busy times and nature's lulls. As a girl, Susan attended her parents' Mennonite Church, Salford Mennonite, founded in 1717, about a mile up the road from their farm. One of the practices of her youth was the foot washing service, when the women of the congregation in pairs washed each other's feet, while the men did the same in another part of the building. Another formative practice was non-resistance, or non-participation in war. She told me once that she was relieved none of her brothers had to go to war. Although 2 of her brothers were called in World War I, the war ended before they had to report. By the time of the Second World War, Mennonites had arranged with the Selective Service to do alternate service rather than military service. Another practice was believers' baptism rather than infant baptism. And Susan was baptized and joined the church at age 13. Here she became a church member in 1922. And she told me why she decided to get baptized. "I was 13 and got scared," she told me. "I guess I thought I was bad or whatever." One of the visiting pastors from Eastern Mennonite College said he thought God had a big stick watching for him to do something wrong. These pastors had meetings at Salford, and I thought, I guess I know what you mean. I was younger than others when they got baptized. Usually they were 17 or 18. For the first years of Susan's life, this church still had preaching in German, and she remembers the first English preacher, who was ordained by lot, as all preachers were, when she was 6 years old. He had no special education at all, and he had umpteen children and was a farmer and didn't get paid, she said. When he preached, if he would get chosen by lot, he would start preaching then. Shortly after that, he would quote scripture, and then he'd say, "Yes." I didn't hear him, but this is just the way she described it. Then he'd quote some more scripture, "Yes." And when I got serious, I got this idea, I'm going to pray for that man. And I did, and things changed for me. And I still do that on a Sunday morning, she told me, if I don't forget. What a difference it makes for you. So her terminology here, I don't know if you heard it, she says, "when I got serious." That is her terminology for getting serious about her faith. And part of getting serious in those days was starting to wear plain clothes, a covering over her hair, and a cape dress. She didn't put on the cape until later. And we'll see a picture in a minute where she does not have the cape on. And she told me she put on the cape when she met her husband. And guess what my mother used to do, she said. When I got to be 15 or so, that would be 2 years after this, she used to buy me nice dress material at Jonas Landis' store. They had nice material. And then she would buy enough for a cape for me, enough material to make a cape. But I didn't want to wear a cape right away. I had already joined the church, but she was waiting for me to say when I wanted the cape. Susan never mentioned the headship of men as a reason that she wore the covering. She only talked about it as a prayer symbol for her. She said, "When I was working at Grandview Hospital," this would have been much later, "there was a fellow working there, and he asked me why I had this covering on all day. And I said, well, my whole life is a prayer. It just came out like that, and I wish it would be." So I have this picture up here because it's the only picture I know of. She told me she had boyfriends before her one that I called grandfather, but I never saw a picture until recently. But this is just to show that she did have a stage of her life where she wore the covering but not the cape and had boyfriends. When Susan got serious about her faith, she told me she also got rid of all her boyfriends. And then one night, I had just gotten rid of all my other boyfriends, she said. The young people used to meet at Methacton Mennonite Church on a Sunday night, and would you believe they asked me that night, so I went along. And then when it was over, you'd go out on the porch and wait until the guys come up, and then you go out. And would you believe, here comes Raymond Kratz with Henry Ruth, she will call Pop from now on. Brings him along, and then we went for a ride, and came back. And then I got with him, and then he took me home. I just turned 17. From that time on till I was almost 20, we went together. Now sometimes we think, why didn't we get married earlier? The trouble was, we would have had to live at wherever Pop was a hired man. Here is Henry on the left, and this would have been several years later with his brother and with my grandmother and his brother's wife, on a honeymoon trip for the two on the right to Eastern Mennonite College. Henry was from a farm about 20 miles away, and to Susan, he just seemed very different from other Mennonite young men. He was also serious about his faith, as she had decided to be, and he wore a plain coat when other Mennonite men his age didn't. This inspired Susan to begin wearing a cape dress for the first time. After she met Henry, she told me she had an experience one night where she felt she got saved. I saw a blue light, she said, and I didn't want to let it go. A blue light like the heavens. This seems to have marked a different place of turning in her life. They got married in March 1929, just before she turned 20. Their first child, a boy, was born the next January. He was followed by 4 more children who were girls. After the second child, they moved out of Susan's parents' house to a rented home at the same farm. And I just am mentioning this because it's significant that they were renters on their property, on their farm, their whole lives. The 9 years following Susan's marriage were a very busy time in her life. She gave birth to 5 children. The youngest isn't on this picture. And my grandfather Henry took up photography around this time. So I know that life included time for taking pictures and also for reading. Here's one of Henry's first pictures of my grandmother reading a book. Susan's and Henry's 5th and last child was born prematurely. Her memories of this time when her last baby started coming 2 months early were very clear and vivid. And the doctor said she needed to go to the hospital in Norristown or else we'll have a dead baby and a sickly mother. And the outcome of that birth was a good one. She did have a healthy baby. And she came back many times to that story as a story of God's grace. These were the days and the location of that farm. She grew up at the house down at the end, and then she moved to this house more on the left when she got married. But church was also important. Finland, in those days, a town in the hills beyond Susan's home in Harleysville, was almost as far away as the Third World is to us now. Susan and Henry were part of a church outreach or mission movement from the early days of their marriage. This was in the 1930s to the 1955 when there was an outpouring of mission work and many new communities were started. And Susan told me how she was drawn into this movement. Clayton Gottschall, he went around and asked all these different people. All these different mission churches started. And he asked Henry for us to come to Finland. I guess we thought that was pretty neat. They would be in their young, early 20s. And there was a sense of adventure and excitement about bringing in people from the surrounding communities who were not Mennonite and getting to know them. And this is when mission churches like Norristown and Conshohocken were started. Susan has many stories of helping to pick up people for church at Finland, and here she is with some Bible school children. They would have a full car of their own family, and then they would pick people up along the way. In Sumney Town, we picked up Al White. He was black, and he was something else. He liked to sing. And then he got a friend not far away, Danish, so we took him. Susan was also a regular Sunday school teacher at Finland and also led some discussion groups at her home. And I heard that she departed from the regular Sunday school lesson occasionally to address her own questions, which possibly was not too acceptable back then. I'm not sure. So outreach happened in many ways. Another way it happened was when the refugees came over from post-World War II, from a devastated Europe, and they found a new home in eastern Pennsylvania. And this was a way that Susan came into contact, even though she never left this area, in touch with the world. We called them DPs, she said, which meant displaced persons. And many local churches, including Brethren in Christ and Mennonite in this local area, would help them get a start in America when they came over. I don't have pictures of this. But evidently in Sumney Town there was a man, they called him a Russian Jew, who brought people over, and they lived in Sumney Town. And he would bring them over to New York and then find sponsoring churches for them. So they started coming to Finland, she told me. And so I got interested because I could understand the German, she said. I could communicate with them in German, and oh my, that was just the beginning. I loved languages, you know. And here, guess what? An old Russian lady who knew German didn't know English, so she told me to come to her house once a week. She wanted to learn English. So she said, come to my house and we'll read the Bible. And then after a while, I thought to myself, why don't I learn Russian from her? And then I got Russian books and stuff. And I can still remember she had these little Russian flashcards tacked on the cupboard up above the sink where you wash dishes, so she could learn Russian. And it went beyond just helping the refugees to actually taking one of them into her home. Other local Mennonite families also did this. They would build additions on their home, in fact, some of them, to make space for refugee families. One of the refugee families was an Austrian mother, single mother with 14 children. And when she died in childbirth in nearby Sumney Town, the children were put out for adoption. Some of the people at the Finland Mennonite Church took the 2 sets of twins, she told me. And she described a later moment. Then here was this 15-year-old boy standing there in church, you know. All of a sudden, I just remember standing there beside him. I don't know what happened, but anyhow, we took him. I could just see him standing there, waiting. And she just described this moment very quietly, as if she was, I don't know, drawn into this relationship, when she just found herself standing beside this boy who needed a home. And so that teenager is on the left here, Siegfried, who became their foster son and is still part of our family reunions with his wife and children and grandchildren. During those years, she was also employed at the Grandview Hospital. This was her first paid job. I got this call, she said, from a friend who was working in the hospital lab, and she goes and calls me to work there. Why she calls me, I don't know. So eventually she became ward clerk. She says, I knew more than the new supervisor sometime. Dumb me, she said. I mean 8th grader me. But you can't help but learn what you're doing. I need to just say that at some point during those years at Grandview Hospital, I think about 20 years, she had to quit because I think she began to experience what she called nerves, what I think we would call depression. She said, I'll tell you how I ended. For 5 years, I put up the tray of instruments for this and that in the operating room. Then the supervisor used to come to the door and she'd say, Susan, I need this. And then we had another supervisor in between there. But I'm talking about before I quit working, the one that was a supervisor then. She was so nice to me at first. She'd say, Susan, just tell me if I don't do this right. But I'm talking about what kind of got me, really got me, she said. I had to have her word at the end of the day, and Pop was waiting to drive home. And here she helped the other girls put up those trays so they wouldn't get overtime. Then they all stood around my desk having fun with my supervisor, and I needed her to help me finish. I was about fit to be tied, and that went on for a long time. I quit. So my supervisor asked my doctor, was it her fault? And he said, no. I got sick, you see, nerves. As I said, there was actually a time of depression here. I was in college at the time, and it wasn't part of the culture to be very open about mental health. And I'm not going to say a lot more about that, but that is also part of her life story. Now we need shuffleboard, yeah. In 1987, Henry and Susan moved off the farm into a retirement home, and this is where we had our conversations on the tape recorder. In her older age, she enjoyed playing organ and piano for worship at the nursing home where she lived. This is actually at the Apple Butter Frolic. She also played the organ there. And as you saw earlier, she was one of the best shuffleboard players well into her 80s. She would beat the men sometimes. She was impressed with that. She won spelling bees and mastered the computer and sent email to her children and grandchildren. and she once even did an in-service training on computers for the staff at the retirement center where she lived. Her faith continued to develop. I'm quoting from her diary of 1993. Ella Hackman had devotions this morning. She had me up at the microphone too. My contribution was from Romans 10:11. For the scripture says, whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. Also one of Ralph Malin's points for you to ponder, which he always gives at the end of Sunday school meditations. There is no risk in abandoning ourselves to God. She took off her covering in that picture. See it laying on the ground there. But the end, let's see, she still struggled as I interviewed her with what she would call the stuff I wish I would forget about her life. And so I'm not going to say any more about some of that. But at the end of her life, she also expressed deep gratitude for God's providence. She often mentioned, as I said, the story of when her youngest was born by C-section 60 years earlier and what a miracle that had been. She told other stories of miracles. She probably would have said it was a miracle she got to celebrate her 75th wedding anniversary here in this picture in 2004 with her husband, and that the next year she got to go to her husband's 100th birthday party. She died some days, about a month later after a stroke. Some days she had a stroke, and then she was alive for maybe 10 days before she died. And so that's me giving, I had never seen this picture until recently, giving her something to eat because she couldn't eat with her stroke and everything. So she had, her death was a time of being surrounded by her family and her friends. This is her final resting place in the cemetery of the Mennonite Church. Her deep gratitude to God often came through in our interviews, and she repeated several times the lines from the hymn, Amazing Grace. "'Twas grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." And she said that long before those last few pictures were taken. And now we need to talk about Mennonite spirituality. What formed her? I would love it if right now we could just take some time and say, what did you notice? But I'm just going to say what I noticed. This was very much a spirituality of place. She lived on that same place her entire life, except when she moved to the nursing home. Compared to my life, the stability of it is what stands out to me. She was part of only one or two specific church communities her whole life. And it was also about a particular place on that farm. And so it's so strikingly different from my life and from the displacement experience, which is more normative for most of us now. Robert Wuthnow, I don't know if you've heard of the Princeton-based religious sociologist, has some wonderful descriptions of a place-based spirituality. He says to live within a spiritual home is to feel that one is secure and that one dwells with God, even to the point of deriving one's identity from being located within this space, thus giving meaning to the idea that the sacred is one of habitation, and we might say of habit and habituation. So this is the way it was for Mennonite women like my grandmother. And it's possible that Mennonites, having been persecuted and chased around in Europe, put down very solid roots in this part of the country in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, where I think someone already mentioned the farm could be a little cloister or sanctuary where they could be separate and faithful. Delbert Weens, a Mennonite Brethren professor of humanities, describes how these communities formed people, and I think he could describe it because he grew up in one. I did not, so I like his description. The church was the center of the community. Knowledge and action and faith were integrated by the underlying cultural structure, and you would absorb this structure as you grew up. So you didn't need religious education because it was being done whether the context was religious or not. And you arrived at adulthood having just absorbed the structure of the faith by living it. And so in my grandmother's life, there was not a need for explicit formation because it was being done also by the community and the people with which she was surrounded. Now, this isn't something we can go back to, and I'm not saying we want to go back to. I just think we need to recognize that we are in a very different place now. And I also want to look at the practices and themes that shaped her and see if any of that can be made more portable for us into the 21st century. Until recently, Mennonite spirituality was embedded in ethical and communal patterns of life within Mennonite subcultures. A quote from the Mennonite Encyclopedia. So just some things that were key in my grandmother's life. A sense that every day was sacred. It wasn't Sunday was sacred and the rest of the day was unrelated week. Food, I don't know how to say this in theological terms, but food and eating together seems to have been sacred. A special relationship to the Bible, singing and playing hymns. There's a book that says singing is the way Mennonites pray, and we've heard references to that. Believer's baptism, expressed in her life by very clear statement that she joined the church at a time when she was convinced. She put on the cape when she was convinced. It's all about a voluntary faith. This term Gelassenheit, generosity, living in rhythm with nature, a particular form of a geographical community that meant that you saw your neighbors daily. These are the things that formed her. A lot of mutual aid and much visiting, the plain clothes, the separate language, emphasis on self-sacrifice, and farm life. So I'm just going over that really quickly. But what I notice is that how much has changed. When I did this research project, I'd known my grandmother all my life, and I felt like our lives were the same. But as I described her life, and I realized that there are some continuities, but I was also struck by the loss of many of the things that made her who she was. And I'm not lamenting that, I'm just noticing it and saying we need to notice that in order to form ourselves spiritually. I'm going to tell you about people in the program in Elkhart because, one, I went there as a student and I'm kind of know some of these people, but also because I feel that the program they began to develop points some directions for how we can be more intentional about spiritual formation in our churches across the country. But I'm just going to tell the story by talking about three particular people. And this is already an old story. What's happening at the seminary now is probably another story that's going to be told. This is back in 1982. The program began there that I believe attempted to build on biblical and Mennonite themes, but also to address the spiritual hunger or vacuum that some people, I skipped a quote, some people feel that we're in a spiritual vacuum right now. This more intentional formation of pastors began as the stories of three people started to converge at what was called Goshen Biblical Seminary, Mennonite Biblical Seminary. They were in they had two parts, back when we had two parts to the church. And we could also look at what happened at the seminary in Virginia, and I just want to be sure to say this because they also developed an important program, and I just don't have time to research that one. Two people there that are important are Wendy Miller and John R. Martin. So this is the AMBS story in a very brief nutshell. Marlon Miller, Marlene Krupf, and Marcus Smucker, the three people I'm going to talk about, all experienced life for a time separated from the Mennonite cultural supports that I described my grandmother lived in. And each is also a person of faith who began to probe a little more widely or deeply for spiritual sustenance. Marlon Miller grew up in Elkhart County near Goshen, Indiana, in a Mennonite community, but he lived for 1 year in Japan as a college student and then spent many years in Europe. On returning to the U.S., he became a professor at the seminary and then the president, and that's when I knew him. Marlon wrote in 1982 in the denominational magazine Gospel Herald in an article called Biblical Spirituality. I'm going to quote this because Marlon died in 1995, and we can't interview him. He wrote this: "It is so easy to become spiritually fatigued. Normal congregational members," he says, "as well as missionaries, can easily become so busy working, witnessing, and serving others, or simply in pursuing other interests, that they neglect their devotional life." That was the term in the 1980s for prayer, I think. "Then spiritual fatigue sets in. Without the disciplines of praying, reading the Bible, and nurturing the inner life, Christians will hardly be able to avoid spiritual emptiness or even burnout, let alone continue to grow in faith and spiritual maturity." End of quote from Marlon. Marlene Krupf was an English teacher who grew up in a typical Mennonite subculture in Oregon. She then spent 2 years in Jamaica on an assignment with Mennonite Central Committee. She described to me how she came back from Jamaica, basically, these are her words, broken in many ways. I had an intuition about this before I left. I wrote in my journal, I don't know if my faith will survive for 2 years in a foreign country, because it's always been connected with the Mennonite community, and it nearly didn't. That's why I started on an intentional journey when I got back, because the violence in Jamaica, the lack of nourishment in ways that I recognized and could receive, wore me down. And I found myself facing my own lack of a vital connection with God by the end of that 2 years. So when she returned, she began on an intentional spiritual search for a vital connection with God. And it led her to a retreat for Mennonite women that was led by a woman named Mary Herr. And there she learned some ancient ways of praying with Scripture that allowed her to hear God in new ways. At about the same time, her pastor in Oregon, Marcus Smucker, was experiencing his own burnout, and I also interviewed him. Marcus had grown up as an Amish boy in Lancaster County. He went to voluntary service in Missouri and then PAX in Europe, went to college and also to New York City to seminary. And then he spent 16 years as a pastor in inner city Portland, Oregon. And these are his words. I was experiencing deep burnout. In those years, I had been very active in ministry in the inner city, as well as working with a congregation that was growing. I was just too involved in too many things. He tried several ways of renewing himself after these many years of pastoral ministry, and finally a friend told him about a silent retreat option. And he describes it. I took 3 days and 2 nights in the Mount Hood forest by myself for a time of fasting, praying, reflecting, and journaling. This was a watershed experience for me spiritually. This was the first time I experienced prolonged solitude. From that experience, I began to realize there was a whole new way to nurture myself, spiritually and emotionally, that I hadn't known before. Almost at the same time, Marlene Krupp, a member of my congregation then, did a contemplative weekend with Jean and Mary Herr. And soon after that, we began leading spirituality retreats and also weekly contemplative groups in the congregation. Now, the connection here with Marlon was that Marcus Smucker was the chair of the board of the seminary at that time, and so Marlon Miller would visit Oregon to visit Marcus as chair, and he would visit the Portland congregation. And Marlon Miller decided that what was happening at the Portland congregation was something he wanted to be part of the formation of pastors at the seminary. Marlene Krupp told me this. Marlon was a pious man who loved the church. He wrote the church-wide document on leadership and authority. And my reading of it, she says, is that he sensed the spiritual bankruptcy of Mennonite pastors. He himself was a person of deep faith. He was a pious man in the best sense of the word. He was a pious man who loved the church and wanted pastors to provide spiritual leadership. He came back to AMBS sort of at the tail end of the activist era, when there was suspicion of piety. I think he saw what was missing. I think it was Marlon's own personal faith, his own vision of what spiritual leadership means in the church. And he was able to see what was missing because he'd been outside the North American context for a long time. And he came back and he saw what he felt was missing. So soon after that, Marlon asked Marcus to come and start a program similar to what he was doing at the Portland Seminary for pastors at the seminary. And we could look at the content of that program some other time, but I just want to say that both Marlene, who came to teach there several years after Marcus did, Marlene and Marcus both said that they valued their past formation in Amish and Mennonite communities and would always bring that with them into the classroom. They said they never went into the classroom without asking how this connects to our Amish and Mennonite tradition, but they felt free to draw on the riches of the larger Christian tradition, and their inner city experience in Portland informed them as well. And as I said, I think this program is an example of some specific things that we can do to be more explicit about how we're formed as Christians, because I believe we're experiencing right now as more and more new people come into this local Mennonite community, and as we expand our horizons interculturally, we're all experiencing something similar to what Marcus, Marlene, and Marlon experienced many years ago, the need for a deeper spiritual grounding as we face new mission encounters. And I'll just stop there.